Chapter 35 He Calls Up the Ants. Came afternoon, then sunlight filtering through the trees ahead. How glorious to step from the gloom into sunlight of open forest country, with grass underfoot and sky overhead. Even more so when on the very rim of a mountain top to gaze away out over where mists merged into distance. Ranges, valleys, sunlit forests, mountains seeming black with scrub, streams glinting like silvered wire, the whisperings seeping up along grassy slopes, swelling up from rock-bound valley and gorge. At our very feet this mountain fell precipitously to join a massive ridge upon which grasses and treetops were swaying. The majestic beauty of everything fairly raised a lump in my throat. I thought that would get you. He was sitting there on the very rim of this mountain top, pulling his pipe from his belt. I promised I would show you Christy Palmerston's track. He stretched out an arm. There it is, right before your eyes. His words held no meaning for me. I sat down beside him. Nearby a bird was singing as if his little heart would burst. My mate's thoughts were elsewhere. His gaze had been wandering over the mountains. Dreamily he turned to me, and it seemed as if the light faded from his eyes. To hell with him, I thought. He can't stand his fellow man. His face turned eastward again as he said abruptly, I promised I'd show you Palmerston's track. Roughly speaking, we are sitting facing Moreland Harbor, 40 miles straight away out over there, past where the mists and horizon meet. The track, in part, it is developing into a road now. A course goes from the coast to Idriess Fall, already rich in sugarcane lands and spreading rapidly. From there, Christy cut a winding track all the way to near here, Milla. A track carries on to Cedar Creek, which they now call Ravenshoe. Only a few miles from here, Christy carried on the track through the ranges north to Herberton, through all that, he pointed, and what is north behind us. It's a bit too big for me to grasp. He must have been a dozen men rolled into one. He was, he agreed emphatically, and he seemed pleased. But all those huge patches of scrub lands stretching away out there ahead of us, surely there's no one there yet. No, he answered, you're gazing out over the Tully scrubs. The axe has not reached there yet. There was deep satisfaction in his voice. Surely it never will, I said. It hardly seems possible. Not for years and years and years anyway, and instinctively I felt I'd said the right thing. Within 25 years the axes would be ringing in those primeval depths. Do these range and scrub and forest lands stretch from here right north to Cairns? Yes, and farther north too. This country is vast. You know it well. I love it, and the fierceness in his voice startled me. Come, he stood up abruptly. We've a few miles yet to go. It will soon be sunset. Just a moment longer, I begged. That big stream gleaming down in the valley away out there. Is that a river, and where does it flow? The Tully, he said, flowing eastward to the coast. They all do. This country is wonderfully well watered. He sat down again. 10,000 creeks that are roaring rivers in the wet. Then the rivers themselves, the Ordeckan, Herbert, Johnstone, Tully, Russell, Mulgrave, Barron, Daintree, rain is measured in feet and even yards along the coast, pouring a sea of fresh water into the ocean every year. Rain in yards, I murmured. No wonder there are strange things in this country. A boyish smile lit up his somber face as he sat back and gazed again out over space. Clasping hands over knees, he murmured, "You still don't believe me. You won't believe in the dancing worms, though I've shown you worms as long as a man. You won't believe in a bird that grows a helmet so he can race through the scrubs, that can beat his body into a living drum. You won't believe in a flower and a fruit that grow underneath the loam. You certainly would not believe in the very essence of life contained in that fruit. Why, I don't believe you'd believe in a kangaroo that climbs trees." Of course I wouldn't, I laughed. But in these scrubs, generally clinging to edge of scrub and forest lands, there is a tree climbing kangaroo. Again I laughed. A bush lad whose thrill for years past had been in hunting the poor old wallaby, the bandicoot, the Euro and roo. Of course I knew all about the kangaroo, a kangaroo that climbed trees. Unable to stop, I laughed and laughed. A curious smile began to play at the corners of his mouth. I had the impression he was gazing round at the hard red earth upon which we were sitting. In an amused voice for him he asked, "Would you believe in a tree that changes its mind?" "How on earth can a tree change its mind?" I replied warily. "By growing into a vine instead. It grows bravely up into a tree, only to suddenly change its mind and turn itself into a vine." "No, I wouldn't believe, would you?" "Of course, I've seen them." "Well then, would you believe in a fern tree that grows upside down?" "No," I answered, a bit sulkily. "I'm not trying to pull your leg," he said evenly. "Well then, would you believe I can call up the ants?" I gazed at him, feeling a bit chilly. After all, I was alone with this man, at the end of the world. Neither I nor any other man but he knew where I was. "Would you believe?" "No," I answered cautiously. "Would you believe," he said patiently, "that there are ants which call up one another with a signal, just as a telegraph operator calls up a station with a Morse signal? Would you believe that I can call up ants with a signal?" "No," I answered defiantly. He reached out, picked up a stout stick, and struck the hard earth before him 5 sharp blows, then again, this time calling dot 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 dot, then dash 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 dash, and again dash. I saw a big ant, antennae outspread, come hurrying out from a grass tuft. Then another one, hair beginning to rise on end. I gazed around. Here came others. Why, I sprang up. Big ants were hurrying towards us from everywhere. Fairly trembling, I jumped back. He laughed as I had not heard him laugh before. Picking up his swag, he chuckled. "Come along, we've got a few miles to go yet." Snatching up my swag, I hurried after him, back into a further scrub. I'd received a nasty shock. The scrub was growing ominously dark as a deep murmur steadily swelled into a harsh roar barely muffled by the timber. "The Tully Falls," he said. "You'll see them at daylight. We'd better camp, or we'll be rolling down over into the gorge in the dark." Another sound, like the swelling waves of an incoming sea, rising to a howl. The wind moaning up the gorge, he said as he lit the fire. "It's a bit blowy out there tonight, and the rains are pouring more water over the falls." It sounded to me like a thunderous storm striving to break free from somewhere deep under the earth. Eagerly I looked forward to the dawn. As we settled back for the evening smoke, I asked, "Where's Ravenshoe from here?" "Oh, about 25 miles northward." I was silent, so he had, as I'd begun to suspect, worked his way round and bypassed the tiny settlement. What cussed streak was it in this man that urged him to keep away from the haunts of his fellow men? And I had been so keen. "Aren't you going to call in there?" "No." "Well then, do the other thing, you surely cow," I thought. But presently I asked, "How did Ravenshoe start?" "Oh, the usual way," he answered absently. "The prospectors and cattlemen pushing up from south and central Queensland. A lot of that country southwest of us, and right back north to the Evelyn, was taken up by Frank Stubley as Evelyn Station. Later, Bill Maslin found magnificent cedars along a creek they christened Cedar Creek. It became a cedar camp of John Moffat's, now called Ravenshoe. Why? Oh, maybe because there are many cedar creeks. Anyway, surveyors working on the Evelyn station came upon some forgotten campfire, and in the fork of a tree the tattered remains of Kingsley's novel Ravenshoe. Those same surveyors have surveyed Cedar Creek for the township that is to be, and renamed it Ravenshoe. Is that how Idriess away back on the coast got its name too? Not exactly. It was first named Nin's Camp, after one of the early pioneers. It became a favorite camping place as settlers came to the Johnstone, and it was named Geraldton. But when Henry Fitzgerald, who I suppose could be called the father of the sugar industry in the North, established a successful plantation, which he called Idriess, the township was then called Idriess, and believe me, that district will spread and prosper and grow and grow. I am positive that not even the Jungle Man could have visualized the fabulously rich Idriess district of today. The origin of many names, he resumed in a more matty way, is sometimes quite interesting. Way back there where the natives entertained us, and he half smiled across the firelight. You thought I was pulling your leg about their spirit beliefs. You've got to learn, of course. Oh well, little Yungabura is named after the spirits. It means the spirit people. So there is a good Australian name for you, signifying a world you are not aware of. I remained warily silent. Very well then, he said. Here's another surprise. You know Almaden. I've only passed through it. Do you know that it is named after a famous Spanish town? I certainly do not. Well, it is, after Almaden in Spain, where they have been mining quicksilver for centuries, I believe. You've surprised me. I thought so, he said in a satisfied sort of way. From spirit people to a historic Spanish town, and back to the Cairns hinterland, is an interesting mixture. Think it out for yourself. Oh well, you know Chiligo. Hardly at all. I've only travelled through and back again. Oh well, you know the end chorus of that old music hall ditty. Hickey, ticky, sicky, cricky, Chiligo, Warrabidori. Don't think I've ever heard it, I replied doubtfully. You must have. Where's your memory? Anyway, Chiligo was named after the word in that chorus, so John Atherton told me anyway, and he also says he named a station of his, Warrabidori, from that refrain too. Surely some of these places have been given Australian names. Oh yes, and right from the earliest days. You've heard of Smithfield. Plenty. Named after Bill Smith, who found a track from the Hodgkinson to the Barren. Yes, he was one of the great band. Hall, Mulligan, Smith, Douglas, Warner, Oswald, Robson, Johnstone, Palmerston, Dalrymple, Atherton, 20 or so of wonder men. Oh well, Smithfield was named after Smith, and surely who dream of gold know of Bill Smith's golden horseshoes. I was puzzled and unbelieving. I see you don't believe me again, he said, but it is fact. Bill Smith had his horse shod with shoes of gold. Eddie Crossland, the blacksmith, made the shoes for him. From gold Smith had won on the Hodgkinson. I've heard of several flash diggers shoeing their horses with gold on the Victorian gold fields, I said doubtfully, but never in Queensland. But look at all the things you haven't heard of that's happened right under your nose, he replied good-humoredly. Anyway, you've only been here 5 minutes. Remember, Bill Smith derived much pleasure in riding his horse with the golden horseshoes along those so-called streets of Smithfield. But golden horseshoes would so soon wear out, I said doubtfully. Not upon Smithfield streets, he replied. Not upon that loam and often slush. He must have won plenty of gold, I said enviously. Not so much. It was the gold he was always going to win that counted with Bill. Did he win it? No, his life ended suddenly, tragically, just as he had done big things and appeared set to do bigger. And soon afterwards the Baron came down in flood and wiped Smithfield itself off the map. How did Smith die? I asked. But he sat frowning at the fire, growing into one of those moods of his again. I threw on a couple of logs to try brighten things up. Shall I put on the billy? I suggested. An idea, he agreed. I'd found out one way to sweeten him up. As we were supping the steaming hot tea, he said amiably, Mariba is going to grow into a good-sized town, and they're going to name their streets after the tableland men who've done things. Good idea, I said, and I hope they will at Ravenshoe too. I suppose they will, he said absently. That country will be settled now that the railway has arrived at Herberton, and rumor has it that it may continue on through the Tumalin and Evelyn to Ravenshoe. Moffat sold his sawmill to Robinson and Parrott a year or so back. Evelyn Station is now being cut up into blocks. The settlers are arriving from the south, mostly from Charters Towers, by buggy and wagon and cart and pack horse. Do you mean to say that beyond all this timber, ahead of us settlers are trekking to take up land just as they did in early settlement days? Yes, of course. In what other way could they come? I don't know, I answered lamely. That is only because you do not think, he replied amiably. The first crowd have arrived already, and with a few head of cattle too. A month or two ago, so I've heard, in Herberton. Charters, Towers, men. The Rankine and Witherspoon brothers, Charlie Kerr and Peter Strang. Some have their womenfolk with them. I've heard that a Norman and Bolton family are coming too, and other Towers people, and the Marin and Major families are preparing for the track, and that tight-lipped mouth of his closed on his pipe stem. By now I knew the signs. I suspected he was dodging civilization again. Even such tiny outposts in this world of ranges, forests, and scrubs. What was the urge that made this man shun these brave little civilizations? That made him hug the places of the wild only. Wouldn't you rather see places like this? He waved his arm towards the gorge and the falls. Abruptly again he had broken in on my very thoughts. You have already seen Ravenshoe, primitive scrub lands, the smoke from the sawmill boiler, the whine of the circular saw, teamsters on a dusty track, hauling the logs to Herberton for the sea, the ring of the axes of the first selectors, who dream that their clearings in the scrubs will develop into rich farms, that a railway may come with the years, that this frontier hamlet of Cedar Creek may actually grow into a town of Ravenshoe, which it will, he added bitterly. Nothing can stop it, but already you have seen it occurring in a dozen places now, since you landed at Cairns. I had to. I was seeing those places even as he spoke, but to me there was, and always had been, a thrill of warmest interest at seeing men and women gamely setting out to carve a home from the wild bush, the bush that can give great reward, but can also, alas, break hearts. What about Mount Garnet, then? You've seen Mount Garnet too. It lies away to the northwest of us, southwest of Ravenshoe. Different, much drier country than the Ravenshoe scrubs, of course, but you've seen it all before. It's been worked for some years now. Mount Garnet, Return Creek, which runs into the Herbert River, Glutton Creek, mining camps scattered over a wide area, men working just as you've seen by my camp along the dry river. The country is tin-bearing all the way to the Mount Albion silver mines. Isolation and transport awful, of course, until after Vollenvitter struck a rich copper show. Then John Moffat opened up, for John Moffat scented business, interested capital, and built a smelters. You'll find the hand of John Moffat in anything big anywhere throughout this vast tableland, and even beyond into the poorly watered country. Quite often Moffat has got that hand of his burnt, but for his pluck and enterprise much of this country would still be as it was 20 years back, perhaps much more. Anyway, you've already seen all that sort of work. Surely you'd rather see sights that you've never seen before, as you will tomorrow. And now I'll turn in." And he rolled up in his blanket, leaving me smoking, gazing up at those wonderful stars, the triumph song of the gorge thundering up from those great falls, close by somewhere out there in the night. Chapter 36. She must obey. Trust him to do the thing properly. He had me on the lip of the world, thrilled to a maelstrom of sound, just as a golden ball arose, and in moments the world was on fire. Where there had been a roaring blackness was now thick green water breaking in seething turmoil far below on a mighty ledge, to shoot down again in clouds of foam and rainbow sprays, while far away down along the black gorge filmy mists came rising in wispy clouds of lace. The longer a man gazed and listened, the more the grandeur and music filled him with awe and wonder. Yet again I understood something of the deep primal quality of the jungle man's love for these wild primitive lands. Several nights later we camped to the song of the Millstream Falls, a happy song quite different to the triumphant thunder of the Tully, the roaring power of the Barren. As I gazed at the Millstream Falls in their setting of beauty, I hoped fervently that when settlement did come it would not tarnish such priceless gems as this. I was to see a score and more of these beautiful waterfalls, and each brought me a surge of sympathy with the jungle man. The Millstream is a fairyland cascade, a vast curtain of sunlit water and sparkling foam, gaily tumbling down into a pretty little lake. There are many falls in that district, the little Millstream, the Milla, the Idriess. We roamed a week and more among them. My mate is the most companionable humor I'd yet known. I did not realize until long afterwards that it was because I was so obviously entranced by these things he loved. And one evening I took advantage of it. "Tell me, how did you call up those ants?" He glanced at me a moment, then laughed up at his precious stars. "No need to have been worried about it," he replied in the best humor I had yet seen him in. "I'm not old Nick calling up his naughty fantods, nor some Arabian seer conjuring up his all-powerful genie. Worse luck, maybe. The ants are simple. They only breed true to kind, like everything else. This particular kind possesses some sense or intelligence, apparently not born in us, though it may only be sleeping. They send and receive vibratory signals when in quest of food, building materials, warnings of the presence of enemies, of coming sudden changes in weather, of coming fire or flood or other causes which might bring disaster to their nest and colony. These few things I've learnt only from observation and from aboriginal friends. Some at least among these ants have hammer heads, regulated by weather, of course. Scouts hurry out in all directions. With the dawn, prospecting for food. A scout stumbles upon some little gold mine in the food line. Immediately he hammers his head upon the hard earth, and from far and wide his fellow ants lift up questing antennae, as do those also down below in the nest. They catch the vibratory message in those antennae of theirs, and all hurry to the spot. Those still down below come pouring up from the nest, for you see they must cut that food into fragments and hurry it back to their storerooms down below in the nest before other hungry creatures of the bush find and devour it, the birds and lizards and insects, and foreign ants also. For everything in the bush is constantly seeking tucker. Remember, everything is constantly hungry and ever on the move for food. And then, until far into the night, in that dreamy voice of his, he talked about ants, telling me fascinating things that I'd never dreamt of, and introduced me to a new world, that restless, pulsating, virile, fiercely energetic, frightening world of the ants. By now we had run out of flour, the only food I would actually miss, for effortlessly he could find food as we walked along. Animal, bird, fish, or plant, secrets the aborigines had taught this old young man, on the faint hope of directing his steps towards the settlement. I suggested, if we had some flour, I'd make a damper. You're sitting on flour now, he replied. I stared stupidly. By now, if he'd said I was sitting on a castle in Spain, I should have hesitated to contradict. We were sitting upon a grassy spur, enjoying a smoko. He pointed to a barely perceptible twig sticking up from the earth by my boot. Dig there. I did so, and at 18 inches depth came upon a large tuber, and another, and another. This is your flour, he said. Boil them in the billy tonight. And those floury yams did make a good substitute. How on earth did you know they were there? I asked. The dried stem of that vine was sticking up only half an inch amongst the grass. No sign of a vine, let alone leaves. The leaves were lying there, he said, shriveled up and fallen aside as the vine died and withered away. Train yourself to observe and memorize until it becomes second nature, which will bring secrets of nature to you. He explained then the native process to make actual flour from that same yam. You can make Johnny cakes from it, damper too, just as you can with our own flour, he said casually, with the same addition of cream of tartar and soda, but don't experiment with plant foods until you've learnt which are wholesome and those that are poisonous. Otherwise you'll never find your golden palmer. I wasn't much interested, could hardly have cared less. In the silence he casually suggested, why don't you ask your own storekeeper about the Tumalin and Evelyn and Ravenshoe when you are so interested in new lands and settlers? What do you mean? I stupidly asked, feeling he had read my thoughts again. All that information is yours for the asking, and a great deal more besides right at Nigger Creek. How so? I asked, thoroughly puzzled. Ask Grigg, the storekeeper. What on earth does he know about it? His half-smile changed to outright laughter as he looked up at the sky, clasping hands across his knee. Men are blind, he exclaimed good-humoredly. Often what they desire is right before them, yet they see nothing. Grigg is an enthusiast upon the possibilities of all these scrubs, right to Ravenshoe. He is crazy on development. He swears must take place there as yet more settlers come. He is right too, he added soberly, and so enthusiastic about it, I'm certain he will take a big hand in it himself. What prophetic words! It is only within very recent years that I have learnt what a big hand that quiet, far-seeing, industrious storekeeper had in the development of a rich district. But now, in the heart of primal bush, I could only sit and wonder at the man at my side who knew so much, at my own ignorance, at the hard-working young storekeeper whom I saw quite often, suddenly presented in such a new light. Yes, I agreed to myself, I was blind and dumb too, pure ivory from the head up. In a mood of sulky self-pity, I wondered if ever I would learn things. You must train yourself, said a soft voice, and I almost jumped. It grows easier after a time. You begin learning subconsciously, as it were. You notice things without noticing. Something like breathing. We are breathing every moment of the day and night, but we don't notice it. I said doubtfully, while sourly thinking that knowledge must come easily to a man who could read thoughts. From a creeper-clad ravine down below us came the happy tinkle-tinkle of a bell-bird. Dreamily my mate was gazing out into blue distance. Belinden Kerr lies away out there, he said, northeast, away out beyond those blue mists, towards the coast. Maybe we'll go walkabout out there sometime, unless you're tired of chasing the golden rainbow, and tired of me. I wouldn't be surprised if there is gold away up on those old mountain crowns, somewhere or other. Just the same, it is very likely looking country. A stiff climb. Over 5,000 feet, but worth it. Between here and there are plenty of waterfalls, too. Some are known to only half a dozen white men at most. Plenty of country, too, that has not heard the ring of even a prospector's pick, let alone the axe. Your river of gold could be waiting you somewhere in there. What might interest you too is that away down there on the coast is a little cove called Dingle Bay, quite near to where natives in the early days massacred a goodly number of the castaways from the wreck of the Maria. She had 68 men aboard sailing to try their luck in New Guinea. They never got there. Anyway, at Dingle Bay, another crowd of your friends, the settlers, are already taking up land, just as they are way back here at Ravenshoe, and the Evelyn and Tumalin and elsewhere. There is wonderful land in that Dingle Bay area also, and I think they'll make a do of it. They certainly have, as witness Idriess and the rapid expansion of a new district. They'll be carving a home and rich farm out of the scrubs while you are still looking for gold. However, you might drop onto another palmer one of these days. Who knows? But we won't find it by sitting here dreaming. He had reached for his swag. We were on the move again. During all this walkabout, he led me to civilization but once, to a lonely settler's hut, stepping out from the scrub into the rosy brightness of sunset. I gaped at a towering kauri pine stretching up in beauty to the sky, its massive trunk now a rosy gold from sunset rays, and there towered a beautiful maple. and just across there a walnut, and just past it a veritable beauty of a hickory, 8 gigantic trees and a lovely nakedness. For a moment I blinked to realize that all scrub had been cleared from around these statuesque giants. For weeks past now we had seen many such, but only some little portion of each mighty bulk, for all the rest was hidden by fellow trees, undergrowth, and foliage. Here was the beginning of a man-made clearing, and these beauties had been allowed to stand in their unobstructed glory. Seen thus they commanded attention, even though there was a panorama of beauty all around. These magnificent giants, supreme accomplishment of vegetable nature, stood proudly awaiting the axe. I stole a glance at the jungle man's face, and saw how he loved trees. To step out from the scrub and thus see those splendid victims standing naked, the remains of their 1,000 fallen brethren, smoldering away in great heaps, the selector's hut with smoke slowly curling up from the chimney down at the farthest edge of the clearing, was to look upon a vivid picture of what might ultimately happen to all these seemingly unperishable scrubs. For where a settler's hut stood now, a township could spring up. In many places it had happened already. As we picked our way over fallen logs down to the hut, I glanced away ahead, just a vista of forest hills, now brightly lit with sunset, merging into hazy blue distances, black patches of scrubs, suggestions of valleys and rocky peaks in sunset distance, with a deep, murmurous sighing from some nearby gorge. And then we were at the hut, roughly but comfortably built of sheets of messmate bark, the musical splash of a little mountaintop waterfall just behind it. The selector hurried out to welcome us with unfeigned pleasure. Yes, we must camp there tonight. He seemed old to me, a lad, but he would have been surprised to know it, believing himself in his prime, despite his grizzled whiskers. Certainly he was all gristle and bone and sinew, capable of doing the work of a horse. Bustling about at the simple cooking, he was just dying for a yarn. Yes, those sticks outside would bring him in a few £100 a fortune, when the bullockies had time to come up on in and haul them out. He could not say when that would be. There was so much more easily accessible timber down below around Ravenshoe and other places below the range, but time would bring the teams up to these parts. Meanwhile he was felling scrub and burning off. Already he'd planted a garden to help keep the tucker bags filled. This land will grow anything, he declared proudly. Any blessed thing will grow up while you look at it. It's growing while I sleep, just like the wool grows on the sheep's back while the squatter sleeps. His gray eyes twinkled as his gnarled hands lifted off the billy. I guess no squatter would think much of this show, he chuckled, as he reached for a damper in the camp oven. He'd just sniff and ride by, but I'll knock a cozy little home out of this scrub within a very few years. And by his voice, I knew his heart was in the land, as the jungle man's was in trees. I made a hog of myself with those fresh-grown vegetables, those pawpaws, bananas, soursops, and 5 fingers. Eat up, he kept insisting. They're growin' faster than a whole family could eat. I'll go out and pick you a bucketful more when you've finished those. There's plenty out there. There's only the birds to eat 'em. Those included a huge bunch of golden red bananas. suspended from a rafter. Easing myself down on the blanket, leaning back against the bark wall, too full to talk, I merely listened, gazing round the hut. His bunk of boards he had sawn from a log was stoutly built along one side of the hut, with a mattress of plaited lawyer cane, over which was neatly spread blankets. 2 guns, with boyish enthusiasm, I noted they were muzzle-loaders, were on pegs just above the bunk. They would be ready loaded. He could awake in the night, reach up his hand, and in a second his gun muzzle would be pointing at the slab and bark door. Obviously he was a homely man, for he had gone to the trouble of knocking up some homemade furniture from rich red cedar. Around the hut were cedar shelves, neatly fitted upon wooden pegs. Wonderingly, I saw that one shelf held a neat row of books. There were weevils in his flour. I knew by the damper he had simply boiled them in the doughboy too, with salt water. Little I cared, I'd enjoyed that doughboy. Anyway, it must be a laborious job to pack a few bags of flour up here. Besides, he wouldn't have the time to be fussy. There were too many trees to chop down, brown sugar in his tea, and now he reached for a black cake of fig tobacco. I knew the smoke would smell strong indeed. I'd last seen such fig tobacco smoked by other settlers when a toddler in the bush in New South Wales, and here it was all over again. Yes, and here he was now, lighting a slush lamp, a homemade wick floating in fat within a dish. I'd used one myself when a boundary rider far away from here, but I'd thought those pioneering days were done. How many lonely nights did he spend lying here dreaming of his farm to be, or poring over those well-thumbed books by this slush lamp's dull, wobbly flame? Yes, a real settler's hut. There were the hobble chains hanging from the wall, a homemade branding iron too, that well-kept axe hanging in its green-hide loop. Nearly asleep, I almost missed a yarn that has intrigued me to this day. Their talk, of course, had drifted onto Aborigines, and the settler was telling of an early settler's wife, in a hut such as this, in a clearing such as this, looking after the place alone. The husband had taken the pack horses and ridden away for rations, and would not be back for another day at the earliest. She was tending the garden when a young lubra raced out from the scrub, screaming for help, a pack of warriors running at her heels. The woman rushed into the hut, pulling the girl with her, slammed the door, and dropped the heavy bar into place. The young lubra crouched sobbing, with her arms round the knees of the white woman, who thrust a gun through a loophole and called out that she would fire. The avengers stopped in a group before the hut. They were led by a witch doctor. He turned and harangued them. They were chewing their beards in rage, rattling their weapons towards the hut, yelling demands for their lubra to come out. They could easily have rushed the hut, though not without loss. The husband had taught the wife how to handle firearms. She was a cool shot and could reload as quickly as a man. She had 2 guns. She could have shot at least 2 before they burst in. After that, well, there were 2 axes, and if both women had snatched those, they might have lasted a moment or 2 longer. However, the witch doctor marched his men sullenly back to the scrub edge. Then he turned back towards the hut, raised his arms to the sky, and cried out in a long-drawn, piercing wail. The settler's wife said afterwards that that awful cry froze her very blood. The lubra sprang up, eyes staring from her head, face awful. She opened her mouth, screamed, and kept screaming. One long, long scream. She snatched up the bar, hurled it aside. As she tore open the door, the startled white woman threw herself upon her, but the lubra threw her aside as if she had been a child. She ran out into the open, still screaming, and with her arms outflung, raced straight to her tribesmen. They cut her to pieces before the white woman's eyes. Then they vanished back into the scrub. I lay awake after the other two had turned in, wondering at this story, which I later learnt was fairly well known. The hut was lit by glowing logs in the big open hearth, but it was black as pitch outside, and the wind was moaning up from the gorge. We were miles away from the settler's hut by midday, in wild forest country, a sea of crags. We boiled the billy below a granite tor nearly the size of a castle. As we lit the pipes before moving on, I said, "I'm puzzled about that story of the lubra last night. Why did she rush out to be slaughtered while there was still a chance of life? The settler's wife was determined to defend her, and she could shoot. They had only to hold out until next day or night, and the settler would return. After all, the Avengers' party was only a small band of picked men, and they might not have dared to rush the hut. If they had, two at least would have been shot dead. The white woman was determined and used to the bush, and she would have been fighting for her life and for her home. Then, with the axe, she would have chopped off a hand or two, and some fingers before they could have broken through that strong door. The lubra, chopping with the other axe, would have fought like a wildcat for her life, as you say they can and do. There would have been 4 or 5 dead men before the others could have smashed into the women with a spear and club, a loss that would have made a much stronger party think twice. And yet when the witch doctor howled for her to come, the lubra went mad, threw open the door, and rushed out to certain death. Why? There are transgressions of a law which go even beyond the fear of death, he answered slowly. I cannot put into our words. I can only feel the meaning of it myself. The aboriginal definitely believes in life after death. Maybe he believes also that for some deep crime against the tribe, or some sacred tribal law, punishment could follow him even in the afterlife. I'm not sure. You may have felt just a little of these strange things when you watched that preparatory dance to the moon in the forest pocket back there. That wail of the witch doctor calling out the errant lubra from the settler's hut was primal. It was not a call for man-made vengeance. It was the spirit call of the tribe going back throughout the ages. No wild aboriginal dare resist that command. Neither man nor woman would have the power to do so. That call is answered by something as deep within them as the mystery of life and death. I do not know any words that could explain this thing. We'd better move on. He stood up, slung on his swag, and moved off. As I followed, a harsh, mournful cry fairly startled me. Wheeling round, I saw, high above the Tully Gorge, a black cockatoo in heavy, lonesome flight. Lonesome indeed is the cry of those heavy black birds above the gorges of the lovely north, and above the gorges of the wild Kimberleys far to the west.